All right, there you go.
Okay, so I'd like to ask you, either of you, a question about the beginnings of the Character Collaborative. Can you talk about the origins and how you felt it was important, why you felt it was important to get started?
Well, maybe I'll start. And Bob and I knew each other probably 8 or 9 years ago. And as a matter of fact, Bob was on my board at an independent school in Idaho. And as we got to know each other, we began to talk about our common interest and passion for good character and the potential important role of character in college admission. And out of those conversations and a couple things we wrote, we decided to create a group of people with a common interest around the country. And Bob, knows virtually everybody in the admissions world, and I knew people in the secondary world. And I think it was back in 2016, we put our first group of people together to talk about the common goal of elevating character in admission. And then each year from that time, we've incrementally grown. And of course, over the last year or so, we've seen monumental changes in the admissions world. And that's, in a sense, opened the door for many more discussions around character and how it fits into a holistic process. And Bob, you should, I think, speak to the dynamics that are going on in admissions offices that are really quite profound, I think.
Well, for many, many years, particularly for those colleges that are highly selective, that is to say, they're admitting fewer than half of the applicants who apply, test scores, whether the SAT or the ACT, have been relied on significantly. And not to the exclusion of high school curriculum and grades and activities and things like that. But in many ways, the test score actually in highly selective institutions could exclude students from consideration. I was the Dean of Admissions and Enrollment at Johns Hopkins University in the 90s, which it doesn't seem long ago to me, but then when I think about it, it is really long ago. So things have changed, but I will tell you that for certain majors at Hopkins back in those days, if students didn't have a certain SAT score, they really didn't stand a chance of getting in. And as a result, that over time, that really admissions officers have come to understand that really is an abuse of the tests. That is to say, I don't think the tests were ever meant to be the overriding factor in college admission. Now, particularly with the pandemic, well over 1,000 colleges, close to 1,500 actually, are either test optional or test blind in admission now. And without the test scores, colleges and universities need to rely not only more heavily on academics, the curriculum and student grades, but also on non-academic factors in the college admission process. And this is where character, among other variables, comes in. And I think now, as a result, the work that the Character Collaborative has been doing is even more important, as David mentioned, with respect to holistic admission. And I think that's why the collaborative is getting some traction now nationwide.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit about how character can really level the playing field socioeconomically for students? How can that factor in? David?
I guess the first observation I would make is turning to the research about how SAT scores, for example, are driven by socioeconomic status and the things that go along with that in terms of test preparation and tutoring and et cetera. And so the research is pretty strong that disadvantaged kids from disadvantaged families are really behind the 8 ball in terms of being able to compete at the same level with students that come from different backgrounds. So to the extent that test scores are not being used or being used less frequently, I believe it opens the door for the kinds of factors and kinds of considerations that young people, regardless of background, would bring to college admissions. And Bob and I talk frequently about, for example, the young man or the young woman who comes home from an inner city high school and takes care of her grandmother every day. And while her mother is at work and his father may not even be a part of the family, what a powerful example of good character and service and commitment. And to have those kinds of young people and those kinds of considerations begin to play more strongly into the admissions process, and as against the say the testing piece, I think will really make a difference long term in access for young people of that kind. It's obviously a very complicated sort of thing in terms of finding the wonderful young people doing wonderful things regardless of where they live. But I'm really hopeful that looking at admissions in a more holistic way, in fact, opens doors rather than closes doors.
And I would imagine that resilience is a very important character trait that you would look for in someone's background. And how could that be shown? If a student were applying, what would be some ways that that student could show their resilience?
That's an excellent. Bob, why don't you take that?
I think just to go along with David's example, you know, particularly among students who where the odds are sort of stacked against them, you know, low-income students from high schools that aren't as well resourced, but yet they stick to it. They have responsibilities at home. They may be taking care of younger siblings. They may certainly be doing activities in those schools. It may be sports, it may be music, theater, it may be service, but yet they're showing up and they're doing well and they're working hard. You know, motivation, I think, I'm not sure that I would say that it trumps grades all of the time or test scores, but it is such a necessary factor in a student's ability to succeed in college. And so we would look for that in college admissions in student recommendations, and just in how the student presents him or herself on the application with regard to the essay and supplemental essay interviews, if those are made available to the student. They are mostly made available in smaller colleges, but now, since so many interviews are being conducted online and virtually, many of the larger institutions have gone to conducting interviews as well, so or at least making it optional for students. So those are some of the ways that admissions officers can discern elements of character or character traits in the process. I will say that one of the challenges from the admissions perspective is transparency. In a way, test scores are easy to understand. You know, even though they tend to be culturally biased, they are understandable. You know, students who perhaps are not admitted to a highly selective institution with test scores that are, you know, 50 or 100 or 150 points lower than the median, understand why. It's a lot more difficult to say, well, you didn't get in because you know, you weren't resilient enough. So that's going to be a big challenge for all of us. But I think again, looking at the curriculum, looking at the students' grades, and looking at their ability to persist and do well is going to be a major factor for most institutions going forward. One last thing, there are 2,300 four-year colleges and universities in the country, nonprofit, private, and public. 2,300. You see numbers thrown around all over the place, but those include two-year colleges and they include for-profit schools. So if you take out those and just look at the traditional four-year colleges, 2,300, only about 200 of them are highly selective, meaning that they accept fewer than half the students who apply. So that means there are 2,100 colleges and universities in the country that aren't as selective. So we're focusing in on that small number, but that's the number that many students, particularly students in urban areas and in suburban areas, are looking at. So we have to remember that. We have to put it in context.
That's a good point too. What about the future with the Character Collaborative? How do you see yourselves informing admissions offices around the country to adopt your work?
Well, one thing I would say, and it takes off from what Bob was describing, this is not easy work. And there's a lot of things that we need to learn and develop over the next several years to keep the faith with the idea of doing holistic admission and paying attention to character in an appropriate, valid, and fair way. And that's really an arena that the Character Collaborative is highly dedicated to. That is to say, working with college people and school people and developing ways to assess character that will hold up over time. Bob and I've just chatted recently about an essay from a colleague describing the need, though being in favor of holistic admission, but needing to look for a standardized metric. And this really gets down, and that's hard work, particularly, as Bob was just saying, moving away from test scores, which is, you've got a number. And so that's the hard work that we all need to do to advance the cause. And the collaborative is engaged in a couple fronts. And as you may know, Judy, we've begun to produce a series of online courses addressing the assessment of assessing character in admission. And the first course was just released in January, and the next course will be on writing character-based letters of reference. And our purpose here is to educate and work with admissions people and school people all over the country. We're all in this together. We need to learn together. And I think that's, and Bob, you should speak to this, but part of the spirit of the collaborative, recognizing the complexity of what we're trying to do, is learning from each other over the next few years, and having the collaborative put into the mix some ways to develop procedures and approaches that are fair and consistent and meet the appropriate standards that the outside world would look for.
Yeah, and I would just very briefly add that we're fortunate to have the backing of the largest professional association in the country for college admissions officers, for school counselors, and for independent counselors and consultants, the National Association of College Admissions Counseling, or NACAC as we call it. They are co-sponsoring our courses, and as a result, we believe that we'll be able to get our courses and our message out to a vast number of institutions, both in the secondary side and in the higher education side. They're not all going to be members of the collaborative. We are a membership organization that requires a little bit of money to make this happen, but hopefully we can expand our membership so that we can reach even more schools and colleges and counselors in the future.
Well, wonderful. Thank you both very much for taking the time to speak with me.
Sure. Happy to do it.